I saw this soldier in khaki uniform shot Senator Aquino on the stairs.
Now to some Filipino opposition reaction. We have with us Sonny Alvarez, president of the Ninoy Aquino movement, a network of Filipino opposition groups located throughout the United States, Europe, and Canada. Prior to going into exile, Mr. Alvarez served as an elected delegate to the Filipino Constitutional Convention in 1972. Mr. Alvarez, what was your reaction to the not guilty verdict?
Although somehow we had expected that something like this will come, we are of course outraged. And more than that, we feel that it's more than a travesty of justice. It's really a breach of common decency and ground rules of fairness. I think that what Mr. Marcos has done is flaunted political power in the Philippines, and even here among our movement people. We feel that this is like the second assassination, and it's just as well orchestrated as the first assassination, but equally as blatant and as grotesque.
Well, what do you mean you expected? You weren't surprised
well,
at the outcome?
Well, Mr. Marcos has always been very good in covering his acts with some color of law. But this time around, he disregarded all the ground rules. With the massive evidence, with the world public opinion more or less shaped, and knowing who shot Mr. Aquino, he comes around and adopts the much discredited position that it was a lone communist gunman that did it. And this time around, it's so well orchestrated. It involved the whole political and judicial machinery of the government.
Are you saying that the judges, the three-person panel of judges?
There is no doubt. If we look into the entire proceeding, from the Supreme Court down the line to the panel of judges, there has been a very sophisticated way of putting these things together. Nonetheless, public opinion is very much awake and would know how these things have developed. And Mr. Marcos seemed to have put the technical arguments in place. But to be able to come out and exonerate all the guilty parties would just be too outrageous, I think, not only for the opposition to accept, but for any common observer. I think world public opinion should be outraged, is outraged, and the Congress, I think, is outraged.
Well, we're going to hear from some couple of members of Congress in a couple of minutes. Let me ask you this, though. What impact do you think that this outcome might have on the prospect of free and fair elections, which are scheduled now?
I think this is an indication of the attitude of Mr. Marcos. Towards even the semblance of a democratic process, we should not hope for a free and honest election. But I, for a Democrat, not meaning belong to the Democratic Party, but I as a Democrat would still give a crack at the election, because I want to give some peaceful opportunity for change there, one last chance. But we should be very wary, because the attitude of Mr. Marcos, it seems, from this outrageous decision and reinstitution of Mr. Ver, is to say that here I am, I have all the powers, I'm giving you an election, I'll give you a whitewash with an election, but I'm going to do all these outrageous things.
So what's your sense of what this reinstatement of General Ver means in terms of Mr. Marcos's commitment to reform of the military?
I think that he's putting on a charade. I think that the reinstatement of Mr. Ver may actually be a prepositioning in order that he will be able to run away neat and clean with elections. With Mr. Ver reinstituted, you know, over the last few years that Congress has put its pressure and the growing disenchantment and perhaps the near chaotic situation in the Philippines, Mr. Marcos has been forced to make some retreats. He's taken some steps backward. He's negotiated.
You mean the U.S. Congress?
With the U.S. Congress, with U.S. public opinion. He's been on television, on your program. He's been with other programs. He's trying to win over some support. And he's called for an election. And now suddenly he comes around with this outrageous decision. Mr. Marcos seems to be saying that, okay, I'm giving you an election. So he thinks that the election is going to be the cure-all. But meanwhile, he plays his old game, and this time around, he plays it more nakedly and more blatantly.
Well, what about the opposition forces in the Philippines now? Mrs. Aquino is expected to run. Senator Laurel, who is another opposition force leader, has already said he is going to run. Is there not a divided opposition here that weakens its opportunity to be effective against the Marcos government with that kind of
No,
division?
I have been in conversation with Manila. I have been in conversation at more than 12 hours ago. And there is an earnest effort among the leaders to come together. the difficult democratic process of putting the nitty-gritty together is still on. And I think that there's going to be a united team.
You think the two of them might run
I think they will
together?
get together, especially after this announcement. More than ever, it has become imperative for Mrs. Aquino to come forward and lead the ticket and throw this issue. The issue of the assassination has now become a political question because the whole political machinery has been an instrument of the conspiracy from the presidency to the Supreme Court down the line.
All right. Let me ask you very briefly how the United States has been warning the Marcos government not to reinstate General Ver. And you heard the reaction from the State Department spokesman today. Do you think the U.S. has been tough enough with the Philippine government?
I think that it has been playing with I think, smooth gloves with Marcos. This time, they have allowed Mr. Marcos to go this far, and Mr. Marcos has put U.S. foreign policy on a spot, because not only Democrats, like Congressman Solars, has been telling his colleagues in the House that the only reason that Mr. Marcos will pay attention to is when you make some very strong signals like chopping military aid. Military aid being chopped by his committee to 25% of the intended 100 million.
All right, well, I think we have to get some of that now from Mr. Solars.
Yes,
Thank you very much.
In any case, I think that foreign policy has come to a point where it has got to make some very hard decisions. It has to call Mr. Marcos's bluff. I think Mr. Marcos has played around too much with the United States and perhaps American public opinion as well.
All right, Mr. Alvarez, thank you. Jim?